Great. Thank you, Dave. It was good to hear Mason's story. And, when people ask me about how to develop as a leader, I certainly don't have all the answers, but I think one is to cultivate a healthy sense of confidence in God and in His call and gifts for us. Another is to step out and to take a risk and to be vulnerable like Mason did, afraid that he's going to get punched in the head or stabbed, and to see God with us in that moment. And today we're going to be talking about what it looks like to take a risk in a different sort of way. So I hope that this will be helpful. And as was true yesterday, would welcome your observations, your noticings, your comments, and questions if you have them. When my uncle was in his 50s, he took early retirement as a bank executive in Vancouver. So his bank basically was encouraging people to step away, and they gave them some kind of sweet parachute package. And so my uncle, who had never been to art school, decided to step away from his position as a bank executive and become an artist. And so he taught himself how to paint, and he eventually ended up having his first public exhibit at an art gallery on Granville Street in Vancouver. And before the first day of his exhibit, he was feeling somewhat anxious and nervous. I think he felt a little excited as well. But if no one bought a single one of my uncle's paintings, if all the art critics gave him bad reviews, and if no one said anything positive about his actual work, there's no way that my uncle could have psychologically regarded himself as a gifted artist. Sure, he could have rationalized that Monet and Van Gogh did not have their greatness recognized in their lifetime. Still, without any positive response or affirmation, it would have been impossible for my uncle to see himself as a great artist. Now, we may say that we're independent beings, that we don't really care what other people think or say about us. But the fact is that we are profoundly shaped by how people respond to us. It is in relationships that we are shaped. It is in relationships that we can be damaged and experience shame. And it is in relationships where our shame can be undone as well. Last night, if you were here, we talked about how being covered by the unmerited grace of God can powerfully shape us. And Jocelyn mentioned from her own story how Jesus, in His love, called her out of a place of shame into a place of freedom. That was beautiful. In the first century, as you know, followers of Christ were persecuted because they were declaring that Jesus, not Caesar, was the true emperor of Rome and, in fact, the entire world. And according to the book of Hebrews, in some cases, they lost their homes or had their property confiscated because of their faith. And then in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, in a fairly recent paraphrase, the writer pens these words: "Discover creative ways to encourage others and to motivate them toward acts of compassion, doing beautiful works as expressions of love. This is not the time to pull away and neglect meeting together, as some have formed the habit of doing. In fact, we should come together even more frequently, eager to encourage and urge each other onward as we anticipate that day, the day of Christ's coming, dawning." So just as the followers of Christ were called to encourage one another during their trials and difficulties, we can help each other overcome our shame through our presence, our body language, our gaze, and our words. Now, some have never experienced the power of words to bring life, and others have only heard piercing words that bring death. So I know a woman who is middle-aged. She's very successful in her professional field, but she always feels that she has to present herself as being no less than perfect. She has a very tough time being vulnerable. When she was 5 years old, this girl walked into the kitchen of her home, and her mother was cooking something on the stove. And the girl asked, "Mom, what are you making for dinner?" And the mother said, I'm frying up some vegetables and cooking some chicken. And the girl said, "Oh, can we have pancakes instead for dinner?" And the mother grabbed her by the hair, pulled her and said, "You don't like my cooking? You don't have to eat." And she tossed her out of the house, shut the door, locked it. And the little girl was saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mommy. I'm so sorry. Please let me in. Please let me in. You don't like my cooking? You don't need to eat it." And eventually, around the girl's bedtime, she was let back in, but she was not given dinner that night, and she went to bed hungry. And so, even though she's a fully grown adult now and successful in her field, she is very careful not to try and not make people angry, and to try to present herself as fully competent and perfect. The experiences of our childhood can shape us, our memories can impact us, but what we don't remember can often have a even more powerful impact on us. What psychologists call implicit memory. So, for example, there was a 19th century physician named Dr. Clafford who had a patient whom he described as Madame X. And so Dr. Clafford would talk to Madame X, and he would discuss this and that, and then he would walk out of the patient's room, or the room he had for his patients. A few minutes later, he would come back in, and the patient would have no recollection as to what they talked about, and they would not and Madame X would not remember the physician, his name, or anything like that. And so one time, Dr. Clafford embedded a pin in his hand, and reached out to shake Madame X's hand, so that when their hands joined together, she experienced a prick and cried out in pain. And then the physician left the room for a few minutes, walked back in, and Madame X had no recollection of their conversation or what had happened, seemingly. And then Dr. Clafford extended his hand toward Madame X, and this time she pulled her hand back and said, "No." And the physician said, "Why did you pull back?" There was just silence. Madame X said, "Sometimes doctors do things that hurt you." So she had no conscious awareness of what had happened, no memory of it, but implicit in her consciousness was this remembrance, and that is implicit memory. Our implicit memory can sway us in ways that are more powerful than our explicit memory. Robert Bly, in his book, A Little Book on the Human Shadow, says, "We carry around a backpack filled with shameful stories." He writes this: "Our parents wanted a nice girl or a nice boy. That is the first act of the drama. It doesn't mean our parents were wicked. They needed us for something. My mother, as a second-generation immigrant, needed my brother and me to help the family look more classy. We do the same thing to our children. It's part of life on this planet. Our parents rejected who we were before we could talk, so the pain of rejection is probably stored in some pre-verbal place." And so Bly says we carry this backpack full of shameful stories. And through the loving interaction that we have with a friend or a family member, a spiritual director, a therapist, a pastor, our backpack filled with shame can be re-narrated and our deficits transformed into places of God-infused graces. So growing up, my friend Katie was loved by her parents. I'm giving her a new name here. And they wanted the best for her. But whenever Katie's mother felt overwhelmed during her adolescent years, and they got into some kind of conversation or argument where Katie was pushing back, Katie's mother, fearing to be violent like her own parents were toward her, walked out of the room. And I'm referring to her mother specifically here. And so, in order for Katie not to feel cut off from her parents, she tried to become the version of herself that her mother wanted her to be. And she found herself in a tailspin of shame, which manifests itself in an eating disorder, which was really, in her case, a desire to completely disappear. And so when Katie was 18 years old, she went to see a counselor, a therapist, and during their first meetings, Katie sat on a chair, but she had her knees sort of up against her chest, her arms around her knees, and she was totally curled in on herself, and she couldn't make any eye contact. Eventually, over time, as the therapist proved to be a trusted figure, treating her with positive regard and acceptance and love, Katie was finally able to make eye contact, and eventually she was able to uncurl and find her voice and embrace her beauty and her power. And that's what the presence of a loving therapist or friend or spiritual director or pastor can do for us. They can make us feel seen and heard and felt, and there can be healing in that. The psychologist John Bradshaw writes, "As infants, we need to hear or sense someone saying to us, 'I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to the world.'" Every infant needs that. Of course, every infant doesn't receive that. And so as part of Dr. John Bradshaw's practice, he would organize groups of 6 or 8 people, including both men and women, and he would organize them so that one of them would come into the center and the others would come around them at a distance that was preferred by the person in the center. So some people wanted people to be right close to them and put their hands on their shoulders or back. And others wanted the group members to be a slight distance away. So the person in the center chose the degree of distance between them and their group members. And then John had the people in the group, in the circle, offer words of affirmation to the person in the center. And according to John, those who had been neglected as children would often start to sob as they heard these words of love and praise. And if a person had never heard an affirming word from a mother figure, a female person praising that person was especially meaningful. And if a person had never heard words of love and affirmation from their father, hearing a male voice was especially moving. I myself was recently in a group where we had a kind of circle of affirmation with some colleagues, and I noticed that as one person shared something, some specific word of praise, it would often inspire someone else to share even more creatively as they built on what the person previously had shared. As we discussed last night, for some people, receiving words of affirmation can be difficult. It's like the words bounce off their chest, or they say, no, 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 no. They try to minimize it. And I talked about how my friend, Dr. Hilary McBride, who is a psychologist and a clinical counselor, is with her patients, and sometimes they have real difficulty making even eye contact. They're carrying that much shame. And so Hillary will sometimes look at the person and say, I'm going to say how I feel about you. I'm going to describe what I feel about you. And this time I want you to hold my gaze for just a few seconds longer. And they're able to do that, and they're able to build up. And it was Hillary who said, it's like teaching someone to curl dumbbells. You know, they start with 5 pounds, and then they work up to 10 pounds, and then 15, and so forth. And she says, as I work with some patients who at first can't make any eye contact with me, over time they're able to hold my gaze for maybe 5 minutes or something like that. So it's pretty amazing. We can increase what psychologists describe as our receptive affect, and we can help others increase that as well. Some people find it even more difficult to experience a sense of affirmation from God because God is invisible. And if a person experiences unconditional love from a human being, sometimes that human being can stand in for God. And the person can say, oh, that is how God sees me. Mr. Rogers, I didn't watch his program when I was growing up as a child. What was it called? Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But he was speaking at a college graduation, and he said something like, I want you to know, graduates, that you don't have to do anything amazing to be loved, for your life to be worthwhile. And then he asked the graduates to close their eyes and for 1 minute imagine someone who would love them into being. And it was very powerful, I think, very moving for the students. And each morning, as I run with our golden retriever, I take time to identify a handful of people who've loved me into being. I thank God for them. And it gives me a sense as I begin my day that I am loved, and that love has come to me through people. Now, this is especially important, I think, to learn how to offer and receive love through people, because by nature, our brains tend to focus on the negative. We tend to be more impacted than by something negative, by a loss of something, than something positive gained. Okay. So, for example, last night, Laura, who's organizing this conference, set me up so that I was able to drive, I think, one of your cars home, or someone who had freely offered their vehicle. And I grabbed the keys, and later I realized that I didn't have my license with me because I'm getting it renewed, so I had to turn it in at an office in Vancouver. The hotel's really close by, and so it's not a big deal. And then I just wanted to make sure that I was getting to the right place because I'm pretty much new to Steinbeck. So I did have my phone out, and I typed the hotel into Waze, the navigation tool. And so I'm driving back, and I get onto the main road, and then I see I hear a siren behind me. And the whir and the flash of a police vehicle behind me. And I think, oh no. So the police officer comes up to me. I'm in the driver's seat and says, "Can I see your license?" I'm like, "No, that's private." I swim in the morning, so thankfully I had a photograph of it because I showed it at the pool along with my vaccine passport. And, don't you have the hard copy? No, I'm putting it in. Do you have a registration? It's not my car, but but I reached into the glove compartment, pulled it out, and he says, "Do you know that?" And I saw that you were looking at your phone. I said, "I was using a navigation tool. Can I do that in Manitoba?" And he's like, "That's a $750 fine." So again, if you didn't get anything else out of the talk, remember that if you're from here, okay? And the human brain feels more stressed out about losing $750 than, receiving a check for $750. So we tend to weight loss more heavily than gain becomes a lift for us, But I dropped the line. Have you heard of Steinbeck Bible College? I'm there this weekend speaking, and anyway, he said, "I'm just going to give you a pass," So I felt really good. But the point is, our amygdala, the alarm center in our brain, tends to use about 2/3 of its neurons to search for dangers, police sirens or something like that, because our ancient ancestors probably needed that to survive in the face of saber-toothed tigers and lions or whatever. And so we tend to have a bias toward the negative, And so my friend Kurt Thompson is a psychiatrist and an author. He points out that it takes less than 3 seconds for shame to form in our brain, but it takes between 60 and 90 seconds for affirmation to form in our brain. And so that's why practices like the Examine, which, Jocelyn, if you've studied spiritual direction, you've probably engaged in, and I think probably Leighton and Glenda may be familiar with this, and Cameron, but where you intentionally pause and you remember the good things that God has brought into your day or across the week, and you sit and savor them, is so important because it literally causes dopamine and serotonin to be released in our brain after about 30 seconds of meditation. And then, as Dan Siegel says, it rewires our brain. Where attention goes, neural firing flows, and neural connections grow. And so to meditate on good things or good words that are given to us can have a powerfully transformative effect on our soul. Another way to deepen a sense of God's love for us is by writing something down. So I was very happy to get a Steinbeck Bible College journal as part of the welcome package. I'll definitely be using that. Fairly recently, I was going through an old journal, and I came across a message that was sent out by a friend about 10 years ago. And the friend wrote this. I hadn't been in touch with this person in years. And he wrote, Ken, this was in an email. "This doesn't happen to me a great deal, but I woke up at 4:30 this morning with a very clear sense that I was to pray for you. I'm not sure why, but I did, and so I did. The image that came to me for you was one of God celebrating over you, in the sense that God not only loves you, but he also likes you. He likes your walk, the way you talk, your sense of humor, even the things you feel are just odd or quirky. Maybe something even you were wishing you could change about yourself. God likes." And I knew that God loved me, but I hadn't thought much about whether God actually liked me or not. And so I printed off the email, I cut it out, and then pasted it into my journal. And there's something about writing something out or printing it off and rereading it that makes it more vivid in our imagination. I knew someone who grew up receiving false messages. The false messages like, "You are dirty, stupid, and ugly." And these inaccurate, demeaning messages filled him with both anxiety and despair. And so as a young adult, a psychiatrist told him about the power of, quote, positive truth statements. She said, "Don't simply come up with them yourself, but go to your best friends and ask them to identify qualities they see in you." And so he reached out to some of his best friends and then typed out their responses. Here are some of the actual responses. You have an amazing capacity to persevere through difficulties. You are a role model and a leader to young men. You are fun and you bring laughter. And he printed out these affirmations, and he's got them in 3 different places, one in his home, one in his vehicle, one in his office. And sometimes, a few times a day, he'll read them. And he says, they're more difficult to refute because others have expressed them. And he says he's experiencing a kind of outside-in healing over time. Someone else was conducting a small sample size experiment with a group of teenage girls. Actually, they were with their sisters. And the researchers asked the girls to write down any negative thoughts they had that affected their own self-esteem. And so they wrote down things like, you are scared, you are worthless, you are unimportant. And then he asked them to read what they had written about themselves to someone else in the group, to their sister, as though it were about them. And they were like, no, I can't do that. That would be mean. That would just be so cruel and unkind. They said, it's normal for us to say this about ourselves, about me. It's normal for me to say this about me, but it's completely different and demeaning if I say it about someone else. And isn't it true that we are often much kinder and more respectful and loving toward others than we are to ourselves? And when a person treats us in a kind and affirming, compassionate way, we're more likely to do the same toward ourselves. And hopefully we can do that to others, and they'll be more likely to do the same for themselves as well. My friend who I described last night, who got drunk, passed out, was thrown up all over the bus, was about to get beaten up, experienced powerful healing when he confessed that to two trusted friends. And they said, in effect, we're not ashamed of you. We're not ashamed for you. We're here and we're not going anywhere. That's powerfully healing. For most of us, the practice of confession is not easy, just revealing our souls. But according to Dr. James Pennebaker, a professor at the University of Texas, he studied the experience of trauma survivors, especially rape and incest survivors. And he discovered that the act of keeping their experiences a secret was often more damaging than the original traumatic event itself. And so there was something about revealing what they had experienced to a trusted figure that really fostered powerful healing. They ended up making fewer visits to their physician, and there was a significant decline in the activity of their stress hormones that was measured. Now, I don't know if it's because I'm of Japanese ancestry, but I assume this is true of a lot of you. It's difficult for me to bare my soul to others, especially when it comes to talking about my own shame and my own failures. One time I was joining a small group of trusted people, and I remember blurting out beforehand that I had recently gone skydiving, and I felt nervous putting on that parachute and eventually jumping out of the plane. It was quite a rush, especially before the parachute opened. Obviously it did open, or else I wouldn't be here right now. But I felt far more terrified about the prospect of burying my soul with the people in the circle, as trustworthy as they were. But over time, I think I've learned to lift the 5-pound dumbbell and the 10-pound dumbbell, and with the grace of God have become more transparent. So I've got a friend named Elizabeth, a longtime friend who I share very transparently with. She ran track and threw the javelin on the track and field team in college. And so sometimes she'll throw a javelin right in between my eyes. I need a rebuke, and I'll get it from Elizabeth. And that's healthy for me. I've got a friend named Mark who lives in another Canadian city, and each week by Zoom, we try and connect, and we confess our sins and vulnerabilities and temptations to each other. I know it sounds really intense and really heavy, but it ends up being a very uplifting and burden lifting, freeing experience. And I just want to be honest. I want to live my life transparently. before others. And I learned about the power of this kind of confession way back when I was single. I was in my student years, and one summer break, I was on a trip, and I ended up meeting someone, and there was just a lot of chemistry between us, at least on my side, so, and a sense of attraction, and she was in another relationship, and I was about to start, I was hoping to start a dating relationship with someone back home. And one night we got together and we started kissing and making out. It was in a public place, but I felt like I had really violated my conscience afterwards. She was in a relationship with someone else. I was hoping to start a dating relationship with someone at home, as I mentioned, and I really felt a sting in my conscience. It just weighed heavily upon me. And so when I got home, I approached a trusted Christian friend, and I confessed what I had done. And I remember him just looking at me, and with tears in his eyes. He was hurt and disappointed, but he expressed his love for me. He said, "Ken, I love you." And as I confessed that, I felt this heavy weight being lifted off of my back. I felt this sense of freedom. And Dan Siegel, this psychiatrist who teaches at UCLA, points out, I didn't realize this at the time, that when we confess something to someone who's trusted, our brain squirts something called GABA all over it that actually has a natural soothing effect. And we know from Scripture, according to James, that when we confess our sins to one another and pray for each other, there is powerful healing in that. And as I think, was it Kevin yesterday, who from Acts Seminary, I think he's in Winnipeg today, was asking how we can reframe things. Sharing our failures and our shame with others can actually help reframe something. And so, some years after that incident, when I was just beginning my work as a pastor, I shared that experience, that failure, with a professor at Fuller Seminary. I was in Southern California. His name is Bobby Clinton. He wrote a book called The Making of a Leader. I didn't really know Bobby, but I wanted to share this with him. We were in his office and explained my failure. And he just paused and he said, thanks for sharing that. He was very gracious. And he said, this failure, since in my opinion it's at a relatively low level, may be redemptive in that it may prevent you from a much larger, catastrophic, more damaging failure in the future. And so sometimes sharing our story with someone else, someone who's trusted, can not only bring a sense of solace and healing and relief, but it can also help us re-narrate the story and see it in new light. And this is certainly true for those of us who belong to God and believe that God is redeeming everything in our life, and that God is causing all things to work together for our ultimate good and His glory as we are shaped into the image of Christ. So in a moment, we can open it up to observations and questions, but I want to read something that was written by Audrey Sandstrom, a professor of writing at the University of Akron, as she shares her story about finding an unexpected confessor in a stranger. So this is Professor Auburn, or did I say Audrey? I meant to say Auburn Sandstrom, a professor of writing at the University of Akron. She writes, I was curled up in a fetal position on a filthy carpet in a cluttered apartment. I'm in horrible withdrawal from a drug addiction. I have a little piece of paper. It's dilapidated because I've been folding it and unfolding it, but I could still make out the phone number on it. I am in a state of bald terror. My husband is out and trying to get a hold of some of the drugs that we needed. But right behind me, sleeping in the bedroom, is my baby boy. I wasn't going to get a Mother of the Year award. In fact, At the age of 29, I was failing at a lot of things, so I decided to get clean. I was soon going to lose the most precious thing I'd ever had in my life, that baby boy. I was so desperate at that moment that I wanted to make use of that phone number. It was something my mother had sent me. She said, "This is a Christian counselor. Maybe sometime you could call this person." It was 2 a.m, but I punched in the numbers. I heard a man say, "Hello." It's probably like, "Hello." And I said, "Hi, I got this number from my mother. Do you think you could maybe talk to me?" He said, "Yes, of course. What's going on?" I told him I was scared and that my marriage had gotten pretty bad. Before long, I started telling him other truths, like I might have a drug problem. And this man just sat with me and he listened and had such a kindness and a gentleness. "Tell me more." "Oh, that must hurt very much." And he stayed up with me the whole night, just being there until the sun rose. By then I was feeling calm. The raw panic had passed. I was feeling okay. I was very grateful to him. And so I said, "I really appreciate you and what you've done for me tonight. How long have you been a Christian counselor?" There was a long pause. He said, "Auburn, please don't hang up. I'm so afraid to tell you this." He pauses again. "You got the wrong number. I'm not a therapist, but I've really enjoyed talking with you." I didn't hang up on him. I never got his name. I never spoke to him again. But the next day, I felt like I was shining. I discovered that there was this completely random love in the universe, that it could be unconditional, and that some of it was for me. And it also became possible as a teetotaling single parent to raise up that precious boy into a magnificent young scholar and athlete who graduated from Princeton with honors. In the deepest, blackest night of despair, if you can get just one pinhole of light, all of grace rushes in. When, like Auburn, we are able to share our shame or perhaps addiction, our failure, we too experience that pinhole of light and all of grace rushes in. And as the light rushes in and we experience that unconditional love, some of which is for us, a lot of which is for us, the shimmering diamond within us of our truth self shines even brighter as we become the person God created and recreated us to be. Let's take a moment to pray. I alluded to this yesterday in the Q&A. At the end of each of the chapters of this forthcoming book, I have prayer exercises, so this is one possible exercise. I want you to meditate for a moment on the words that God the Father says to Jesus at his baptism. And imagine that God is speaking these words to you. He names you, calls you by name, Jocelyn, James, whatever your name is. Leighton, Glenda, Cameron, Arlene, Jacob, whatever your name is. You are my daughter or son whom I love. I am so pleased with you. I am delighted that you are on the earth. And just keep repeating that. Name yourself. You are my daughter or son whom I love. I am so pleased with you. I'm delighted that you're on the earth. Breathe deeply. Exhale slowly. And repeat. Name, you are my daughter, son whom I love. And as you sit, reminded that you are surrounded by the presence of a God who loves you, a God whose grace rushes into your life, floods your life. I wonder if you might listen for a moment in silence to hear any words of affirmation that God might be directing toward you. Is there a word that God is speaking to you? You are, or you're. And then finally, imagine one person that God has brought into your life. I hope that you can imagine at least one person who has loved you into being, who has in some way become the face of God's love to you. Just imagine that person's face now and hold that person in your imagination for a few seconds. And thank God for them. Thank you for hold that person's countenance and their look in your imagination, in your heart. Amen.